And then there's this identification of Putin with Hitler. Any enemy, any strong enemy is seen as a reincarnation of Hitler. But it would require a psychiatrist to analyze better this phobia. But phobia, it definitely is. It is not rational. It is not based on national interest.
Hier ist der Wohlstandsneurotiker, der Podcast der Neulandrebellen. Mein Name ist Tom J. Wellbrock. Heute haben wir einen Interviewgast. Peter Ford ist ein britischer Diplomat, der bereits als britischer Botschafter in Bahrain und Syrien tätig war. Ford ist seit 2023 stellvertretender Vorsitzender der britischen Labour-Party. Gleichzeitig ist er stellvertretender Vorsitzender der Workers Partei, die sich gegen die Labour-Party stellt. Das ist so in etwa vergleichbar mit BSW und die Linke. Davor war er Vertreter des Generalkommissars des UNO-Hilfswerks für Palästina-Flüchtlinge in Jordanien. In unserem Interview äußert er sich zu den bevorstehenden Wahlen im Vereinigten Königreich und gibt auch eine Prognose über die aktive Beteiligung des Vereinigten Königreiches am Konflikt in der Ukraine ab. Peter, können Sie mir etwas über die Workers Party of Britain erzählen?
I served in several Arab capitals, including Damascus, where I was ambassador. And after that career, I had a second career with the United Nations. Held very close to my heart, helping the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees. And I did that for 8 years before retiring from paid employment about 10 years ago. But I've done since then a lot of political campaigning, particularly during lockdown. I was one of those terrible people who campaigned against lockdown, risking arrest on many occasions. And perhaps we can come back to that as we progress in this discussion, because I think the experience of lockdown has marked this era and has marked this wave of elections, although you'd never guess it from the public discourse. So that's me, and now the Workers' Party is fielding 154 candidates in Britain. That's about a quarter of the total seats in the country. We are spread all over the country, but particularly in the big cities of London, Birmingham, and Manchester, because that's where our core vote is found. And our core vote is mainly the working class, the depressed element of the working class, which includes many Muslims, as it happens, because of our focus on Palestine. We have gathered the support of a great many Muslims in this country. More than half of our candidates in the general election are Muslims. But we are not the Muslim party. There are many independent Muslim candidates, and most of our program is not focused on Muslim issues at all, but on broader working class issues and the general issue of peace, which affects everybody.
Welche Erwartungen haben Sie an die Parlamentswahlen in Großbritannien? Was erwartet die Partei zu erreichen?
Well, because of the way the British system works, we don't have proportional representation. It's therefore very difficult to win seats in the parliament for one of the smaller parties, one of the newcomers. You can get millions of votes in Britain and still not get a single parliamentary seat. So realistically, we're hoping to win several seats. Our number one goal is to see our leader, George Galloway, re-elected to Parliament. As you're aware, he won a surprise victory only back in February in a partial election. He won with a big majority. It was a great shock to the British political system. So our number one priority is to ensure that our leader, George Galloway, is re-elected in Rochdale, and he stands a good chance of doing that. We also aim to get over 150,000 votes across the nation. Why 150,000? Well, because under the British system, the political party only qualifies for state financial support if they get at least one member of parliament and 150,000 votes nationwide. So that's our second major goal after winning again in Rochdale. And if we achieve those objectives, then we will have a beachhead in Parliament, a foothold. And our leader is a fantastic orator. Even his enemies fear him, fear his oratory, and fear his passion. He's one of those rare things, a conviction politician. He's not in it for a career or money, but because he passionately believes in the causes that he fights for, which are mainly peace in Europe and the Middle East.
Die vorangegangene Kampagne im Februar war sehr schmutzig gegen George Galloway, der häufig beschuldigt wurde, ein kremlnaher Agent zu sein und pro-russisch zu sein. Inwiefern ist eine solche Verleumdungskampagne Ihrer Meinung nach charakteristisch für den derzeitigen Zustand der britischen Politik im Allgemeinen?
Yes, our party and particularly our leader has suffered a lot from smears and attacks by the establishment. A lot of dirty politics has been played against us because we are a threat to the establishment. We are. This is why they try so hard to undermine us and to damage our leader. He is a thorn in their side, and our enemies are particularly the state of Israel, I have to say. They and their supporters in Britain conspire to damage our party. They mobilize so-called charities to do their work for them, campaigning including on the streets of Rochdale, calling our leader a racist for the sin of supporting Palestine and opposing the massacres in Gaza. We're also excluded by the establishment from the mainstream media. This is more important than the attacks by the state of Israel and its allies. To be excluded from the BBC, from Sky, the Rupert Murdoch-controlled press. The British press is tightly controlled by half a dozen individuals or owners, and they keep us away. It's a battle to get any kind of hearing for our points of view. They were during the Rochdale campaign. They could not avoid it. They had to cover it because it was so unusual. And for 5 minutes, we were the center of attention. It was a seismic shock to the establishment when our leader came from nowhere to win with a large majority, defeating the Labour Party, which had assumed that Rochdale would be an easy win. So it was a big shock. And our main enemy, in fact, is the Labour Party, which has infiltrated many of our institutions. I say this sadly because I used to be a member of the party myself in the period when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader. He was another rebel who was, after a couple of years, maneuvered out of his position as leader of the Labour Party. Our leader and Corbyn have in the past been allies, not close allies, but brothers in arms, particularly in support of Palestine. So yes, we, as a small but revolutionary party, we've faced a lot of dirty tricks.
Können Sie mir etwas mehr über die Grundprinzipien sagen, die die Partei von den etablierten Koalitionen unterscheiden?
Well, we portray ourselves as being the authentic voice of the working class. The Labour Party historically came from the working class and still tries to pretend that it is somehow a champion of the working class. But it's at least 20 years since at least Tony Blair became the Prime Minister, became the leader of Labour and took the Labour Party to what I call the extreme centre. Took it on some issues so far to the right that they're even more right-wing than the Conservatives. That the Labour Party claims to be the working class champions, but we represent old-fashioned Labour. The model for our current leader is Tony Benn, who was a historic figure of the left in Britain. So we appeal to the working class because of our focus on Palestine and the Middle East. It's true that we do appeal particularly to the Muslim working class, also the Muslim middle class, because of that focus on Palestine. And this is the main part of our program. But we're also unusual because we are unashamedly populist. We're not afraid to be described as populist. We don't freak out if somebody mentions Donald Trump. In fact, our leader, after he won in Rochdale, said that he was going to make Rochdale great again. So he's not afraid to channel Trump, who at least appears to want to make peace in Eastern Europe. We're also unashamedly socially conservative. We don't go with fashionable causes. We are not woke. We lose some votes, particularly among young people, because of that. But we have to be true to what we believe. We're also anti-green. This is most unusual in British and perhaps European politics. We are deeply skeptical about climate change. In particular, we are determined to resist the sacrifices that the establishment want to impose on working people in the mad pursuit of the impossible net zero, the war on cars, the war on gas boilers, the compulsion to buy electric cars, the limits on movement in cities, all that. We strongly oppose it, and that puts us at odds with the establishment of all the mainstream parties.
Was ist Ihre Strategie gegen die Labour Party?
Well, our strategy is to resist, to be the spearhead of resistance against the establishment, using these elections to establish a beachhead in Parliament. The British Parliament, in some ways, is broken. It does not have any fair representation for the population because, as I mentioned, we don't have proportional representation. But nevertheless, even a handful of rebel MPs can have an impact, especially when they have leaders as charismatic as George Galloway and Nigel Farage, who is the leader of the other upstart party of the right, the Reform Party. And in many ways, these two charismatic politicians, so unlike the leaders of Labour, Steer Karma, who is extremely wooden, and the leader of the Conservatives, the diminutive Rishi Sunak, who is already yesterday's man. These two dissident leaders are good speakers, good communicators, speak with passion. They are conviction politicians, and they are the men of the future. So, assuming they both get into Parliament, they will make waves.
Wie beurteilen Sie die Situation der Reformpartei mit Nigel Farage, die in den Umfragen dramatisch zugelegt hat? Glauben Sie, dass sie zum Problem für Sie als Vertreter der arbeitenden Bevölkerung werden könnte? Glauben Sie, dass es Überschneidungen zwischen Ihren Zielgruppen gibt?
Yes, reform are something of a threat to the Workers Party. They're a bigger threat to the other mainstream parties. They get most of their support from the Conservatives. They are the real old-fashioned Conservatives in the way that we, Workers' Party, are the real old-fashioned Labour Party. But they also have appeal among the working class who voted for Brexit. Their leader, Nigel Farage, was the leader of the movement to take Britain out of the EU, and that made him popular with many in the working class. And so they're taking votes from the Labour working class, and they will take a few votes from us. But we're happy as long as they undermine the other big parties. And since we share some of their program, particularly resistance to net zero, we can see a silver lining in their emergence. And they have had a dramatic emergence, especially since Farage announced that he was going to stand for election. Just 2 weeks ago, there has been a dramatic shift in British politics. It's ironic. It's a shift to the right, and yet the opinion polls tell us that the Labour Party, which is nominally left, is going to win by an enormous majority. But what's really happening is that the Labour are profiting from the disillusionment with the government and from the absence of an authentic voice on the left, which is the gap that our party are trying to fill, but ignored by the mainstream media. That is we need 2 elections to make our big breakthrough. We aim to get a foothold in these elections and then work to make ourselves the main opposition by 2025. In the meanwhile, of course, there may have been a war, and these things can change. I mentioned earlier that there was one subject that was absent from the debate in all the elections, and that was lockdown. But there's another absent, at least in Britain, and that is the war in Europe. Because even the so-called rebels of the Reform Party, the Farage Party, have nothing to say about the distinct chance of us being dragged into war in Eastern Europe. We regard them as not authentic. They appear to flirt with Russia. Their leader sometimes says nice things about Putin, but he doesn't have the courage that we do to oppose clearly the support that our country and NATO are giving to Ukraine. And they don't flag the danger, the enormous risks that we think Europe is taking in provoking the Russians, and we're being all sucked closer and closer to the edge of disaster.
Glauben Sie, dass es eine reale Chance gibt, dass das Vereinigte Königreich, Deutschland, Frankreich, ganz Europa in diesen Ukraine-Krieg hineingezogen wird?
Yes, and the risk will be even greater after the inevitable victory of the British Labour-Party. This is a party which has always been Atlanticist, even in the days when it was nominally left-wing. And in recent years, since the Blair period, the party has moved further and further to the right in international affairs. It is distinctly possible that once in power, Labour will engage the UK in an even more blatant, forward, and direct manner in the Ukraine conflict than the Conservative government have. That is a real risk, especially under the present leader, who seems to have no beliefs or principles whatever, and who lacks international experience. I'm personally quite afraid that my country is going to be dragged into conflict. And of course, if Britain was in conflict, then Germany would be as well.
Gibt es eine Angst unter den Bürgern? Spüren die Menschen, dass der Krieg kommt?
Well, as I mentioned, the subject is absent from the debate. It's astonishing that what should be the main issue, an issue of war and peace that will affect absolutely everybody in the country, is almost totally absent from the debate, because the mainstream parties are all the same in international affairs. You can be pro-American, more pro-American, or most pro-American. You can be Russophobic, more Russophobic, or most Russophobic. You can't be neutral or pro-peace. So there is no difference among any of the main parties, including the Reform, on the key subject of peace. The subject is therefore ignored, and the man and the woman in the street go about ignorant of the real disaster. They keep hearing about the climate emergency, which is not real, but they don't hear about the war emergency, which is very real and staring us in the face. So this election, as it's conducted in Britain, it's an illusion. They're not addressing either the terrible experience of the COVID years, the lockdown period when all our freedoms were taken away from us, and they're not discussing the imminent war with Russia.
Wie beurteilen Sie persönlich, also als Diplomat, als ehemaliger Botschafter in Syrien und in Bahrain, die derzeitige internationale Politik des Vereinigten Königreichs in Bezug auf die beiden laufenden Konflikte in der Ukraine und in Gaza?
I'm deeply opposed to British foreign policy in almost all its manifestations, whether it's relations with America, with Russia, with China, or the Middle East. We're totally on the wrong track. And here's the thing about foreign policy, which makes it different from the economy. At least in the economy, you see the results of the decisions of the politicians, and they can be held to account. But in foreign policy, you rarely see a clear result. For example, for many years, the West has waged a kind of war against Syria with sanctions and with covert assistance for the Syrian rebels. Has the policy succeeded? Of course not. It has been an absolute total failure, as judged by the fact that the Assad government is still in power. And yet no one criticizes the people who made that policy, which continues until today, even though it is a total abject failure by any standards. No one asks for any evidence of success. So when a word of advice, never had any respect for diplomats. We don't deserve it. We are not judged by results. I fear for my country going forward with a Labour government. They have our shadow foreign secretary is an embarrassment. He's a total embarrassment. He is I don't want to be too insulting, but he can't help it. But he is deeply incapable of being a foreign secretary, and nobody among the Labour ranks has any experience or knowledge of foreign affairs. They will just follow blindly the current line of subservience to America and Russophobia. In British politics, it is not possible to be too Russophobic. You can be Russophobic to a deranged degree, and you will be considered normal. I'm afraid this is one of the sad things about British politics, and has been for many years. We have a phobia about Russia, going back deep into our history, and I'm afraid it comes into play. We also have a sad complex that goes back, I have to say this, to be honest, to the Second World War. The British always think they're fighting against the Second World War. If you look, for example, at the British TV schedules, there will be a choice of 50 or 60 programs. I guarantee you there will always, at any time of the day, be a program about the Second World War. We have a national obsession with the Second World War, and we think that any new conflict is a replay of the Second World War, and therefore Putin is the new Hitler. We are reliving in the national imagination. This is the thing that the experts never get, the importance of the national imagination. And this is the governing factor behind our foreign policy. We have this idea in our imagination of a benign America and a Russia which is still in the imagination communist, a Soviet, and a leader similar to Hitler. And this is why we pursue the blind policies that we do.
Sie haben erwähnt, dass man in der britischen Politik nie russophob genug oder zu russophob sein kann. Worin liegt hier das Problem?
I think it goes back to the days of empire. We were rivals with Russia for mastery in Asia, back in the days when we had an Indian empire, and there was a struggle in Central Asia. We also have a thing about communism. The British ruling class still have a latent fear of Russia on that account. And then there's this identification of Putin with Hitler. Any enemy, any strong enemy, is seen as a reincarnation of Hitler. But it would require a psychiatrist to analyze better this phobia. But phobia, it definitely is. It is not rational. It is not based on national interest. And that's the other thing that diplomats they pay lip service to national interest, but very rarely does it actually figure in calculations. I mean, look at the policy on Ukraine. Again, judged by results, the policy has been worse than a failure. It has been an own goal. We have made things worse for Ukraine by failing to encourage Ukraine early on to come to a peace agreement. They could have had it easily based on neutrality and not joining NATO. There was a chance 2 years ago, largely because of the British, even more than the Americans. Zelensky did not take that opportunity, and his country is now much worse off. But no one in the political establishment wants to look at the question, is our policy making things worse or better? And by results, we have made things infinitely worse for Ukraine.
Wie beurteilen Sie die wirtschaftliche Lage der britischen Bürger im Vereinigten Königreich? Hat die derzeitige Regierung sie verbessert oder hat die Regierung das Leben der Menschen wirtschaftlich verschlechtert?
Things are much worse in Britain since over the last at least 15 years, the period in which the Conservatives have been in power, although the seeds of economic failure were sown earlier by the Labour government. The previous Labour government gave the keys to the economy to the National Bank, the Bank of England, who have driven the national finances over a cliff. They started printing money like crazy in 2008 at the time of the banking crisis. And what we've been seeing for more than a decade have been the repercussions of the mismanagement of that crisis. The continued overprinting of money, which in the end produced the inevitable wave of inflation that we've seen over the last 3 years. All that coming on top of the terrible mistakes in the handling of the epidemic from the virus, and massive overreaction. All over Europe, governments took a sledgehammer to their economies, paying people for months, if not years on end, to do nothing. Future historians will look back and will simply not understand how our leaders can have allowed that to happen. But that is another major reason why the British economy is failing. And in fact, what we've seen in Europe has been a price paid by politicians for their stupid failures during the COVID years, belatedly, even without discussing the lockdowns and all those mistakes. But people are aware of the cost of living crisis and the economic crisis, which is a direct result of the mishandling of COVID, and governments everywhere are paying a price. Sadly, they've not learned any lessons. Any discussion of the lessons from the biggest shock to the system that has happened anywhere in the world economy for many, many years, the COVID crisis and the lockdowns, nobody has learned any lessons, and we are doomed to repeat the same thing if it ever happens again. And the third, of course, the other major reason for economic failure in Britain has been our mistakes over Russia and Ukraine. We led the charge for sanctions on Russia. And although we did not pay a very direct price like Germany, we did not cut ourselves off literally from the pipelines. Indirectly, we suffered just as much. Again, a huge own goal, which increased the inflationary pressures. So incumbent parties everywhere are reaping the whirlwind which they sowed over COVID, over Russia, over sanctions, without the voters being aware of why it all happened. But they are aware that they are deeply unhappy and suffering.
Warum protestieren die Menschen nicht gegen die Regierung?
Because of the media. The people are not allowed to think just as all the main political parties believe the same thing. For example, on climate, you could be greener or greenest. You can't be brown. No choice. So in the mainstream media, the establishment who control the mainstream media everywhere are all fervent believers in the climate religion. And they were fervent believers in the lockdown religion and the vaccines religion. There was no challenge or no visible challenge except on the streets. I marched during the lockdown with 200,000 people in London on more than one occasion. Marches that were largely ignored in the media. But you could see the anger and frustration of the people.
Trotz der wirtschaftlichen Folgen von Covid, der wirtschaftlichen Folgen der Sanktionen und allem anderen, unterstützt das Vereinigte Königreich weiterhin die Ukraine und den Gaza-Konflikt finanziell. Warum eigentlich?
Well, one reason is that there is no opposition in Parliament, and that is why it was such a shock to the system that George Galloway, the leader of the Workers Party, won a seat in Rochdale a few months ago. And since then, he has been very vocal inside Parliament. But before then, there was literally nobody. There was no voice for Palestine or opposing our involvement in the Ukraine war. Literally nobody. This is not how democracy is supposed to work. And I think our entire constitutional system will have to be looked at in light of the way the insurgent parties, ourselves and Farage's right-wing Reform Party, are going to get millions of votes in the upcoming elections, but we'll be lucky if we get more than 10 seats in Parliament between us. This is going to be the next big question in British politics, the constitutional question, because as our leader describes the two main parties, they're the two cheeks of the same backside. They are, our leader has a style. He is rude. He is a bit like Trump. He is not afraid to offend, but he knows how to use the words. He says openly that he despises our prime minister. This is a new discourse in British politics. That is why we are shaking things up and why the establishment are so keen to silence us. We bring not just a new content, but a new style to British politics, which to some extent is echoed by Farage. Farage is not rude, but he does bring something of a new frankness to language.
Ist es möglich, dass das Vereinigte Königreich den Frieden in diesen Konflikten in Gaza, in der Ukraine, in allen Konflikten auf der Welt fördert?
No, I'm deeply pessimistic about the direction that we shall take. We are doomed to continue on the road of failure. The British government on the Labour will not change its policy. People are expecting perhaps some change of tone towards Europe. The Labour Party were not in favour of Brexit, and they are accused of wanting to take Britain back into the EU. But personally, I doubt if we will see any real change in that direction or any other direction. If anything, we will just see the British following the American line. We will continue to intervene militarily in support of Israel. We will continue, in fact, we will increase our financial and military support for Ukraine. We will send soldiers, more soldiers. We're already covertly sending soldiers to Ukraine. This will become more overt, and we will take risks with national security. I wish I could predict something better, but this is the line that we are on. And I feel sorry for our European partners that you are going to be somewhat carried along with this British extremism. Already Boris Johnson prevented you making peace in Eastern Europe. 2 years ago, was it? That was mainly down to Britain. And I'm afraid we're going to see more of that in the months ahead.
Wie bewerten Sie die Ergebnisse der Europawahlen?
I believe it was encouraging to see the results of the European elections. The establishment parties were put very much on the defensive. And the emergence of a strong right, I think, can only be good for democracy. The liberal progressives have had a near monopoly for long enough, and some on the right in Europe are challenging the security orthodoxy. Although we mustn't have illusions there. We thought that Meloni in Italy might be a ray of hope with regard to the conflict in Eastern Europe, but on the contrary, she has just gone with the flow. She has prioritized taking money from Brussels, and this is my fear about the European right, and it includes the French as well, that they will be seduced. They will face economic problems. They will prioritize extracting money from Brussels. they are not sincerely opposed to Russophobia, and they will be a disappointment in that regard. There are some in Hungary, Orban, in Serbia. There are authentic voices of the right who are closer to the trouble in Eastern Europe, who can feel the coming earthquake. They can feel the first tremors in the ground, and they are worried. I hope that other elements in the European right will take it equally seriously. That is our only hope for avoiding a major war, with one exception, one bright star on the horizon: Trump. If Trump wins in November, then almost certainly Europe will not be able to go to war alone with Russia, and things may change for the better. Fingers crossed.
Was sind die interessanten Entwicklungen bei den Parlamentswahlen im Vereinigten Königreich, die wir verfolgen sollten?
The left has completely lost its way, completely lost its attachment to Labour. It's now focused everywhere on identity politics, on woke issues, and on climate activism. The left is no longer the left. The left is now what I call the extreme center. The redistribution of wealth is not on the agenda of the left anywhere anymore, but they're heavily into these issues which sadly mobilize youth, the issues of identity and climate activism. This is very, very sad, but that has been the fate of the left. The left has been hollowed out. The left has no more ideological underpinning or social. The working class don't like the left anymore. The left is supported mainly by the middle class. The left is the left of the teachers and the lawyers and the judges. It's not the left of the working class. This is why parties of the right are able so successfully to steal votes from the left among the disenchanted working class everywhere.
Befürchten Sie eine Einmischung Russlands, Chinas oder Amerikas in die Parlamentswahlen?
It's already happening. The government of Israel is giving every assistance to the enemies of the Workers Party, actively colluding with the Labour Party to ensure the defeat of our leader in Rochdale. The state of Israel has many allies in British politics and British media, but no one wants to talk about that. They only want to talk about Russian interference. I don't think, of course, the Americans are always interfering, but they are less visible, and they don't really need to intervene so much because the establishment parties are already in the pockets of Washington, and they will do Washington's bidding. It doesn't matter really from Washington's point of view who wins the British election. And I don't believe for a moment that Russia and China are intervening in any meaningful way in the British elections. Having said that, as a former diplomat, I can say that part of my job used to be to try to interfere in elections through normal diplomacy. cultivation of allies, attempts to shape national debates. For example, I tried to encourage the Syrian government to move in a pro-Western direction when I was working there. That is the normal work of diplomats. But the use of propaganda, disinformation, etc., this is mainly the province of Israel and the CIA and the British security services. Oh, and some of the Brussels and German services as well.
Was ist jetzt das nationale Interesse Großbritanniens?
Well, it's something very simple. Peace. The avoidance of war is the main predictor of a country's not just security, but also its economic security. I mentioned Switzerland. Neutrality is one of the best methods of staying safe, prosperous, and secure. I would like to see a British government that didn't try to provoke our enemies, didn't try to annoy them, undermine them, attack them, but rather tried to avoid making enemies. This isn't much to ask, but our governments, whether it's Conservative or Labour, ignore this simple truth that the best security for any country is not to have enemies. This means that you respect them, you respect their borders, you respect their near west. Ukraine is the near west to Russia. And therefore, you do not march the borders of NATO right up to the borders of Russia. You do not interfere in countries on Russia's borders. Simply by not provoking your potential enemies, you perform the best possible service for your people. Security comes from not making enemies. That's a revolutionary thought. Just try not to make enemies.